What a lot of sex therapists will recommend is scheduling sex. And I'll tell you why I never recommend that.
Hey y'all, welcome back to Made It Out. We are in New York today, and I'm here with Casey Tanner, finally.
Finally. It took so long to make this work. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy you're here, and I just finished your book, Feel It All, which is absolutely incredible. Everybody needs to read it, and I'm so grateful that I just get to kind of pick your brain.
Oh my gosh.
So thank you for
glad
being
to be here.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about something that we get so many DMs about.
Yeah.
People asking me, and I'm like, I don't fucking know.
Right.
That's what you're here for. We're going to talk about lesbian bed death.
Cool. Let's do it.
Let's just start with, what is lesbian bed death?
Yeah. Well, it is a well-researched phenomenon. It does actually exist. It's not a myth. And it's the reality that in many lesbian relationships, when compared to heterosexual relationships mostly, they find that at a certain point, they start to have less sex, or sex starts to become less centered in the dynamic. What I think doesn't get talked about as much around lesbian bed death is how people feel about that once that starts to happen. I think there's this assumption that because it's called lesbian bed death, I mean, that sounds so dire. It sounds horrible.
Yeah.
That anybody experiencing it would be like, get me out of here. This is awful. But it's actually much more nuanced than that. Different people feel differently about sex being less centered as they get older, as a relationship grows. So yeah, lesbian bed death could be something that people want to avoid. It could be something that people are looking for techniques to overcome. But for a lot of people, especially in older age, it might be something that actually doesn't bother them that much. It might be that, I would say my take on lesbian bed death is different from a lot of people, that I believe lesbians are very powerful, very creative. And when I hear that sex is less centered later in life, I don't automatically assume less intimacy. I sometimes just assume more creative forms of intimacy, different intimacy, because I think most of us know just because you're having sex doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's connective. It doesn't mean it's doing what you're setting out to do. So yeah, there might be more heterosexual couples out there having sex, but what does their communication look like? What's their quality time look like? So I think when we just look at this one variable, it's easy to then say, oh, there's something wrong with lesbians. But I think it actually might point to the opposite. I think more research is needed. But however, if you're experiencing lesbian bed death, however you feel about it is, of course, valid.
Okay, there's so much to unpack. That's so interesting.
This episode is sponsored by Osea. I personally have struggled to find a body wash that doesn't dry out my skin, but Osea's new Undaria Algae Body Wash has been the perfect addition to my shower routine. It leaves my skin feeling so hydrated, and it smells incredible. It's also vegan and cruelty-free.
Upgrade your shower with clean, vegan face and body care from Osea. Get 10% off your first order site-wide with code MADE at OseaMalibu.com. You'll get free samples with every order and free shipping on orders over $60. Head to OSEAMalibu.com and use code MADE for 10% off.
First, I want to understand, is there like a clinical reason why it happens to lesbians more, or like a dynamic reason?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a ton of different things. I think when you're talking about women, you're talking about people who are more likely to have experienced sexual trauma. So that can have something to do with the way that people experience desire. I think when you're talking about women, especially now, especially post Me Too movement, we know that so many of us have experienced this trauma. And so when we go to pursue somebody sexually, the last thing we want to do is violate consent. But what ends up happening is that we can sometimes swing too far to the other end of the spectrum, and we never initiate because we're afraid of violating somebody, or we don't make strong initiations because we're worried that it's going to feel like pressure.
Yeah.
And so what you have often in these situations is, two or more lesbians in a relationship who really want to be having sex with one another, who for whatever reason are afraid to initiate that, whether it's fear of rejection or fear of coming across like a man who many of us have experienced harm from before. Yeah. So those are some of the reasons. I do think that, people with vulvas and people with estrogen, our desire can also just operate differently. It can certainly shift during peri and postmenopause. But I also think that women are center platonic relationships more in their lives, and often their partners do also function as best friends. And so I think there are times when that friendship can feel satisfying enough to carry a relationship through a period where sex may not be the thing.
Yeah. This is really interesting because as someone who I just opened up on a recent episode about something that I experienced in my past with men, and I find myself to be like a more dominant kind of personality, a more like someone who would be an initiator, but I have a really hard time with that. And I wonder if it does have to do with that experience, and that's just like very buried and I don't connect those two things.
I would wonder. I think it's something absolutely worth wondering about, and may not be like front of mind in the moment when you're deciding whether or not to initiate. But yeah, if somebody was completely unattuned to you in a moment and hurt you because of that, then you might find yourself trying to hyper attune to somebody else and whether or not they want you, and might err on the side of assuming that they're not into it. They're not going to say yes.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So I've always thought that lesbian bed death was maybe because of two females having more of a responsive desire. Is that true?
No, I think it's absolutely worth talking about. So again, people with vulvas are typically, well, I wouldn't say typically, more people with vulvas than not have what's called responsive desire. Responsive desire means that rather than getting turned on like out of nowhere, being like, oh, where did that come from? We are more sensitive to the context around us. And context can look like a number of things. It can look like the literal place where we are. Is it erotic? Is it turning me on? Is it calm enough? Is it quiet enough? It could look like the relational context, what's going on between us right now, and how does my sexuality respond to that? It could look like the context of my day. Has it been a stressful day? And people with responsive desire I will say their nervous systems are more attuned to those things and more likely to react to them. So when you get two or more people with responsive desire in a relationship together, if you don't have the tools to create the contexts that work, you could never see a context that works, or you could rarely see a context that works. And because one of the most powerful contexts for turning people on is newness, long-term relationships can really suffer in this way, because as that context of newness and discovery starts to fade, people, if they don't know, aren't replacing that with different contexts that then work for them, which is why a lot of the work we do around eroticism and long-term relationships is about helping you see a partner in a new light, whether that's, seeing the way that they do their job and being like, wow, you're a badass. And I've known you for 5 years, but I've never seen this part of you. And wow, this is really working for me. Or we've never done karaoke before. Let's see what you're like when you're singing Total Eclipse of the Heart, right? It might really do it for me. But we get into routines and rituals, and 10 years into a relationship, how much of that are we doing? And so if you are really sensitive to context and the context looks the same all the time, then yeah, those moments of having an intrinsic desire to have sex will be more few and far between.
How do we, because you're saying that it's kind of more about how we feel about the amount of sexual activity that is happening.
Totally.
How do we unpack that, considering that there's so much like social expectations around it?
Right. How do we know if it's actually how we feel, or if we've just got all those narratives? Yeah, totally. I think when I'm working with clients, especially couples, people in relationships, what is so much more distressing than the number of times they're having sex per week or per month is the experience of going out to dinner with another couple, especially another queer couple, hearing about their sex life, and then that comparison game. And going, gosh, we weren't really that upset about our sex life an hour ago, but now we're hearing about all the things they're doing. Maybe they're opening their relationship. Maybe, they're just having great public sex, whatever it is. And now suddenly we're looking at ourselves going like, should we break up? And we can actually jump that quickly to, are we incompatible, when we have these moments of comparison and find ourselves not having sex as much as the other people around us. So yeah, to your point, it is, I think, nearly impossible to untangle the impact of our sex miseducation from the thing that we really desire. But the more we can have conversations with ourselves, with our therapists, with our partners, where we say, okay, let's as much as we can set aside the trope that we should be having sex 3 times a week, what, our best friends do, and ask like, what rhythm feels right for us? If we look at the last couple years of our relationship, when have we felt the most connected? Maybe sex has been part of that, but maybe we were traveling together a lot during that time. Or maybe, you were less focused on work during that time, or we were really making sure we ate dinner together. Again, just constantly depedestalizing sex as the thing that makes relationships last, because it is one piece of a big puzzle. And for some people, it's not that important of a piece.
That is so interesting.
My favorite day of the week is Sunday, and that's because I put all of my energy towards self-care. And my favorite self-care practice is my everything shower.
I have spent years crafting the perfect shower routine, but I've really struggled to find a body wash that isn't too harsh and doesn't dry out my skin. Osea's new Undaria Algae Body Wash has been the perfect addition to my shower lineup. It's gentle and it's made with plant-based ingredients, which helps to support the skin's moisture barrier to cleanse, but it doesn't strip. I've also been trying to be more mindful of the products I use, and this product is perfect because it's vegan, cruelty-free, and it's climate neutral.
Upgrade your shower with clean, vegan face and body care from Osea. Get 10% off your first order site-wide with code MADE at OseaMalibu.com. You'll get free samples with every order and free shipping on orders over $60. Head to OSEAMalibu.com and use code MADE for 10% off.
I want to understand how dynamics, I've heard you speak on this before, and I want to dig a little bit deeper, how the dynamics in the relationship outside of the bedroom are mirrored in the bedroom.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Totally. I think it's Esther Perel that says, tell me how you were loved and I'll tell you how you make love. Because the way that we were raised before we even were sexual, before we even had sexual partners, has everything to do with the way that we show up during sex. And when we're in adult relationships, we're often mirroring the patterns we experienced in those childhood relationships. And then inevitably the dynamics make their way into the bedroom. And I'm going to be a little nerdy for a second, but the main mechanism by which this happens is attachment style. We develop an attachment style early in life, typically anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. That attachment style makes its way into the way that we date and to the way that we experience long-term relationships. And it also makes its way into the bedroom. Sex is an attachment behavior. And so we can't, shut the bedroom door and leave outside of it our fears of rejection, our fears of somebody being too needy with us, our fears of being abandoned, our fears of not being good enough, right? All of those things follow us into the bedroom. And so when I'm working with a client who's struggling to orgasm, struggling to maintain an erection, struggling to understand their desire, we're talking a little bit about orgasms and we're talking a little bit about sex, but what we're mostly talking about is their life experiences, because more often than not, that is what is behind what we call sexual dysfunction than anything else.
It just seems like this pattern of just the focus on sex. And it's like
it's the last thing we need. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I know for me, for a lot of my clients, when I am telling myself, we got to have more sex, my sexual desire just plummets because that pressure is not erotic.
Yeah.
It's the opposite. It's actually just giving me a task to fail at, which is never going to be something that turns me on. So yes, if you've read my book, a lot of the work that I do is around saying it is not about quantity of sex, right? We're looking at quality of sex, but more than that, the quality of the connection.
Yeah. You talk in the book about how trauma can inform how we show up in our relationships and to intimacy. And you've kind of hit on some of these things, the miseducation and the oppression. So can we kind of talk about those building blocks and go through that?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, I guess the first thing that I'll say about that is we all kind of need to rethink what we think of as trauma, because especially when we're talking about our sex lives, I think the assumption is the trauma that affects our sex lives is going to be sexual trauma. And of course, that's true, right? If you've experienced a rape or an assault, inevitably that's going to make its way into your sex life. But one important thing that I teach is that any kind of trauma can make its way into your sex life. And I call the sex miseducation that most of us received growing up trauma. And I think that people have a reaction to that. They say, well, we all got that horrible sex miseducation. How could something that's so common be a trauma? And I'm like, just because it's common doesn't mean it's not a trauma, right? Just because it happened to most of the people you know doesn't mean it was okay when it happened to you. And so when I'm looking at the building blocks that create our sexualities, I'm starting out at those early moments where, oh, maybe you're sitting with your family and a sex scene comes on the TV and nobody says anything. The whole family freezes. And you're just left there to try to make sense of what it is that you're seeing on screen. That can actually feel like a mini trauma. It can feel very lonely for a child who doesn't know what's happening in front of them. So first of all, if you're listening and you're thinking, this, trauma, this doesn't apply to me, there is really no thing too small. If you felt lonely, if you felt abandoned and trying to understand the way your body was changing, or the feelings that you were experiencing, that can be an attachment trauma. So putting that out there to begin with. But yeah, the layers. I mean, I think we've got the attachment traumas that I was just describing. We've got some of those more acute traumas, like experiences of assault, experiences of rape, experiences of natural disaster, a parent's divorce. And then we also have the traumatic experience of growing up with a ton of oppressive messaging about sexuality that I'm sure you've talked about in many different ways on this show, whether that's sexism, racism, fatphobia, ableism, right? Like all of those things become building blocks to the way that we understand our sexuality.
Yeah. I do actually kind of want to get more into the miseducation because I found it really interesting how you view that as something that is like an active kind of act of violence against our community, any minority really.
Yes.
But I kind of want to get into that because I found that so eye-opening.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I think I could talk about it intellectually, but I guess I'll ask you this question. When you think back to the sex ed that you got or the lack thereof, are there any palpable memories that you have of learning something specific or being confused in a particular way? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but when you think of sex ed as a child, what do you think about?
I literally just remember being in like science class and then wheeling the TV in.
Oh, yeah.
And separating the boys and the girls.
Yeah, okay. That's enough, right? You've already said enough, right? Well, now we are going to educate people differently based on their genitals, right? So people with penises over here, you don't need to know anything about periods. You don't need to know anything about the experience of people with vulvas. You are going to learn about masturbation. And over here, we're going to have people with vulvas who we're not going to talk about pleasure with. We're not going to talk about orgasms with. We're going to talk about periods. We're going to talk about pregnancy. We're going to use some scare tactics with you. So right away, you have an extremely gendered experience of sex ed that sets typically women up to be very afraid, to be on guard, and in some cases rightfully so, and to not think about their pleasure at all.
Yeah.
And the experience of these people who are like, okay, go over there, boys, who are already from a young age being given permission to think about their pleasure. So you ask the question of like, why are women later in life experiencing more lesbian bed death? Well, look at what happened at the beginning of our lives. We were already set up to think differently about sex.
Yeah, because we really aren't taught that we should. It almost feels like shameful to think about your own like desire or pleasure. And it's interesting how that changed when I was with men. It was like such a function. It was just like, okay, I just need to do this to just like have that part of the relationship, make that connection, whatever. And it wasn't anything about me.
Totally.
And so it felt like when I had sex with a woman, my whole world opened up because it was like, oh, like, but there is all of that shame that's kind of buried in that of
Totally.
But wait, am I supposed to feel this? Should I feel, how do I even approach this or feel good about this?
Well, I'm really glad you said that. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I also used to sleep with men. And in some ways, I found that like having a regular sex life with men was easier, not because I enjoyed it more, I certainly didn't, but because we weren't that emotionally attuned to one another. We weren't asking hard questions about sex. So it just sort of was happening. The assumption was that it was going to be happening, whether or not we particularly wanted to or felt connected otherwise. So when I look at the amount of sex that I maybe had with men partners in the past versus the way my sex life looks with partners who are queer now, I actually might be having less sex now, if I'm honest. Better sex. I feel like myself. And this is why, again, I'm like, we really miss something when we get caught up in quantity and number of times a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is quality sex then?
Yeah. Ooh, I mean, gosh, I feel like we all have to ask ourselves this question, like, what does a good sex life mean to us? For me, I think it's feeling like I can bring all parts of myself to the table. The part of me that, like might just want to feel sexy and lean into an alter ego, but the part of me that might need a break because I got to go pee. The part of me that got their feelings hurt earlier that morning when my partner snapped at me. I want all of those parts to be allowed in our sex life because they're inevitably going to be there. Mm-hmm. The question is, are we going to talk about them or not? Right? Like that interaction you had before work this morning, it's going to be there when you're having sex. But are you going to address that or are you not? And I think because people socialized as women are given more tools to communicate about it, I do think we're having more of those conversations, or at least we're trying to. So yeah, a good sex life for me has to be more about the act. It has to be about the way that we talk about it before, during, and after. And yeah, I think when I think about a great sexual partner, I just think about somebody that's willing to be curious, but who's I can really trust. Because I think when we think about how to be assertive partners, how to initiate sex, we often think, gosh, that confidence has to come from us. But I think a huge piece of it has to be the confidence that the other person is going to say no if they're not feeling it. Because if we think that they're going to say yes no matter what, it's actually very hard to initiate because we're risking violating their consent, right? We're risking violating parts of them. So the ability to say no to a partner, I think, is one of the biggest things that facilitates an adventurous sex life.
How do you cultivate the type of relationship that, like, how do you get there?
Yeah. I mean, I think you start by talking about it. You don't have to launch into, okay, how am I going to know if you're enjoying sex, or what's your relationship with orgasm? You could actually just start with the question, what has talking about sex looked like for you in past relationships? Is that something you're comfortable with? I think knowing how your partner or partners experience conversations about sex, because sex can be a triggering topic. Just bringing it into the room can raise our blood pressure, can make us freeze, can make us have a fight or flight response. So testing the waters by all right, let's just bring sex into the room in a conversation. How do we do with that? Knowing if your partner is somebody that likes to debrief sex right after it happens, when, okay, sex is over, you turn to each other, you say, how was that for you? Some people love that. Other people are like, please ask me in 5 days. I don't want to think about what just happened. Mm-hmm. So getting to understand the nuances of how each of you regulate your nervous systems around the topic of sex. Maybe the conversations have to be 10-minute check-ins once a week, because if you talk about it for longer than that, it just gets overwhelming. Yeah. Or maybe you have a sex therapist and you know that person's office is the container where you're going to talk about sex, so that it doesn't feel like it sort of has to always be on the table.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think creating a container in your relationship where you both know we can handle talking about sex in this way.
Yeah. What are some of the strategies for compromise? Like, let's say you just have completely different libidos and you're trying to have these conversations, but you're just very different in that way.
Yeah.
What's the approach in the compromise?
Yeah. Well, I would say my approach, if I'm sitting across from a couple that has what we call desire discrepancy, is first to normalize it. Every single one of us has a desire discrepancy with our partner. It might, for some people, feel more extreme, but we're all going to have differences in either the amount of sex we want to have, the type of sex we want to have, how important orgasm is to us, how kinky we want it to look or not. So all of us have a desire discrepancy, right? But often the people who end up in my office are people who have a desire discrepancy that has become distressing enough that they're like, we need some help. Where I start is almost never with, here's how to have sex differently. I almost always start with, do each of you actually feel understood by the other person in the way that you approach sex? Because by the time people come to my office, often the partner that has lower sexual desire, wants to have sex less, or maybe is less kinky, or whatever that looks like, is feeling like, I am not enough, I am broken. And their partner might get to be in a place where they agree. They're like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want sex more? You're the problem. We love to conceptualize our partners as the problem when it comes to desire discrepancy, because it's hard to imagine that, we might need to look at ourselves in that way. And often the higher desire partner is feeling greedy. They're feeling like I want too much, which of course, again, connects back to our childhood, right? If you felt like you weren't enough as a kid, if you felt like you wanted too much or needed too much as a kid, all of that can come up in this experience of desire discrepancy. So I start with saying, like, what would it look like to actually believe that neither you or your partner was broken right now? What would it look like to actually believe that, yeah, they're on this end of the spectrum and I'm on this end of the spectrum, and neither is right or wrong? And I'm not trying to move you to their side of the spectrum, and I'm not trying to move you to their side of the spectrum. We're just trying to develop a language to talk about it without hurting each other. Because I think what is more distressing than the desire discrepancy is the feeling of just being lonely. Lonely as the partner that keeps saying no to sex and wishes that they wanted it more. Lonely as the partner that keeps asking for sex and keeps hearing the no. Like, we can bridge that loneliness pretty quickly without even changing the sexual dynamic. So we start there. But then, yeah, I think, again, I'll call on Esther Perel, my hero, that it's about building a bridge, right? How do we meet in the middle? But it's not always, how do I put this? Compromising is not always taking the average of what both people want. So for example, let's say one person's like, I would like to have sex 5 times a week. And the other person says, I would like to have sex once a week. The answer is not, okay, well, why don't we have sex 3 times a week? Because actually, neither partner is really getting their need met in that compromise. The person who wants sex 5 times a week is still not satisfied. The person who wants sex once a week is having sex that they don't want to be having. So a lot of this is around, how do you take care of your sexual self if you're the partner that wants more sex and it's not as available to you as you want, right? Do you have a robust solo sex life? Like, what do your masturbation practices look like? Do you feel permission to engage in them? How do you experience eroticism, whether or not your partner is available, even if you're monogamous, right? You don't have to open a relationship to get some of that. So that's often the conversation with the higher desire partner is, how do you continue to experience yourself erotic even when your partner is available? How do you help your nervous system regulate around your partner's no or your experience of rejection? How do you connect those dots back to all those other experiences of rejection you've had during your life and remind yourself, that's not what's happening here, but my body kind of thinks that it's what's happening here.
Yeah.
And for the lower desire partner, if they're open to it, it can be around figuring out, okay, what are the contexts that do turn you on, and can we create more of them? Maybe after date night, you're ready, you're there. But when your partner initiates sex 10 minutes after you get home from work, it's a no-go, right? We can start to shift a schedule around to create an open door. So it's a different approach depending on where each partner is. But yeah, over time, you do start to see partners speaking each other's language and finding a way.
It's literally all communication.
Yes. Yeah, right. I know it is the cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason.
Is there ever a time where it's just too far apart?
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it is like worth saying.
Yes, definitely. I think that I am somebody that believes that if sex is really important to you, and if you and your partner or partners have genuinely tried to make it work, and I mean like gone to therapy, sourced community resources, whatever that looks like, and it's not there and you're a monogamous person, then I absolutely think ending a relationship is a valid decision, right? That's a moment when a lot of people decide to explore non-monogamy because they're like, wow, so much of this relationship works. It's just the sex that doesn't. There are other ways we can get these needs met. But yeah, I don't think there's shame in ending a relationship because the sex doesn't work. Sex is, for a lot of us, really important. And especially if we're monogamous and there's only one person that we're getting sex from, then yeah, I think making a decision based on how sex feels can make sense. Now, do I think that is, the right choice for the majority of people? I think most people haven't actually gotten the support they've needed to really know if they've explored all the corners of that.
How do you know when it's time to seek out a therapist?
Yeah. I mean, it is always time. It is never too early. I think the mistake that a lot of people in relationships make is they wait for crisis. And then they have to go through this really grueling experience of like multiple intake sessions when all they want to do is talk about the crisis at hand. So if you have a sex therapist on your erotic team and, you know, as part of your relationship, then when the moments of crisis happen, you have somebody that really knows you and your partners who can immediately jump in and help you with that. So even if it's like, I'm going to see somebody every other week, and I'm going to maybe up it to once a week when we have more difficult times, I think if you can afford to have a sex therapist on the team of your relationship, you know, as long as they're good and they know what they're doing, there's no downside.
You said erotic team.
Erotic teaming,
What
yeah.
else is on the team? Who else is on the team?
Oh my gosh, great question. Who else is on? Okay, I think friends got to be on the team.
Oh,
I think that there is this societal pattern where when we're teenagers, when we're dating in our 20s, we talk about sex with our friends all the time. We get into the nitty gritty of what happened with who. But then when we get into these long-term committed partnerships, there's this shift that happens. And I think it's a loyalty, I'll call it a loyalty shift, where it's like, gosh, I don't want you to see the way my partner may or may not be showing up for me in our sex life. So I might talk about sex, but I'm going to talk about it a lot more vaguely. You're not going to get the details. And suddenly we stop getting ideas from one another. We stop getting vulnerable with each other around sex. In trying to protect our relationship, we actually miss out on getting the support that we need to maybe improve our relationship. So I think at least one friend that you can say, God, you know, my partner and I had really shitty sex last week.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially in like specifically the lesbian community, it's so enmeshed, or it can be. So
yeah.
You're around, all your girlfriend's friends are your friends, and you know, so it's hard. You don't want to like
totally
lay them bare, or you
right.
know, to
It's
everyone.
Such a great point, and I think that's why the conversation has to start with your partners. Like, hey, what is your comfort level with me sharing about our sex life, assuming I'm going to be doing it in a respectful way?
Right.
Maybe they say, well, I don't want you just talking to everybody about our sex life, but there's this one friend that you have that I trust, that I think has our back, that is on our team generally, that if you wanted to talk about some of the harder pieces of this, that would be okay. Yeah. So get that permission so that you don't have to worry about like, what would my partner think if they were here listening to this?
Yeah. What is your advice for a couple that is in a rut?
Yeah. I think first, name it. Like if you can say, hey, babe, are we in a rut? Like, we haven't been having sex as much lately. Gosh, everyone can just like take a breath, because it actually, I think, is the monster behind the door that is much less scary when you just look at it. Yeah, we haven't had sex in a few months. Okay. Life goes on. And then I would just start with a lot of curiosity, like, where do you think that's coming from for us? Or where do you think that's coming from for you? You might get some really good information, like, I've just been really stressed lately, or I've been so attracted to you, but I'm hating my own body, and being naked with myself is like really tough right now. Because you gotta get to the reason or a hypothesis. Otherwise you'll intervene in all the wrong things, right? If the story that you're telling yourself is, my partner's no longer attracted to me, you're going to intervene in what, your own appearance, when far more often than not, it is about what the other person is experiencing in themselves. So depending on, you know, the reason, I think there's sort of like a decision tree from there. If what your partner is experiencing is terrible body image, for example, you might say, okay, well, are there certain times or places where we have sex that is less triggering for you? Like maybe we just commit to keeping the lights off right now, or staying under the covers if that's what you need. Or, you know, it can be kind of hot to keep some of our clothes on. What would that feel like? But if the hypothesis you come to is maybe we just haven't been as connected, I would start with scheduling time for play. And I think what a lot of sex therapists will recommend is scheduling sex. And I'll tell you why I never recommend that. As we talked about earlier, pressure is the opposite of eroticism. Unless it's like consensual BDSM pressure, right? It's just going to feel like an opportunity to fail. So if I'm already in a rut and I'm looking at my calendar and on Wednesday night, we're supposed to have sex, I'm already anxious. I'm already turned off. I'm already like, you know, that's just something I'm going to fail. But if I look at my calendar on Wednesday night and I'm like, okay, we're going to an escape room together. Or we are doing a challenge where we have to each cook each other a meal from whatever is in our fridge, right? Now we're playing together. Now we're laughing. Now we are opening the door for sex if we want it, but there's no failure if it doesn't happen. So I would start by making a list of the things that feel like play and scheduling that.
We play a game.
Let's do it.
It's called You Haul or You Ghost.
Okay.
So she's perfect in every way.
Yeah.
But maybe that's just like one little quirk.
Okay. Got it.
They can only fall asleep to Jerry Springer reruns.
You ghost. I ghost.
It's bizarre.
I gotta go. I can't do that. I can't really fall asleep to TV at all, but if it's a man's voice, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna happen. No, thank you.
That's fair. Yeah, that's a lot of drama right before bed. I wonder what your dreams would be like.
And I am so influenceable. Like, it is going to influence my dreams. So yeah, it's got to be a pass on that. Almost anything over that. Yeah.
They only listen to podcasts in the car. They will not listen to music.
Ooh. Okay. They sound, I don't know. They sound a little like, what's the word? It sounds a little holier than thou. Like, I don't do music. I only learn things. I only can do this intellect. I think it's a no. You've got to be able to kick back. Like, what's a road trip going to look like at that point?
Yeah, that's fair. I actually don't think this would bother me that much.
Okay, yeah,
because
tell
I'm
me.
such a podcast listener.
True.
So,
Yeah.
like, my alone car time, I'll do my music then.
Yeah.
And I'll listen to the podcast. But
Okay.
if it is rooted in that, then I guess I'm
Right. It's like,
ghosting.
where is this coming from?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the question I would ask. So maybe need more information is my answer. Yeah.
Hey, anybody out there though that is listening
Yeah.
to our podcast all the time, you haul.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm sure you don't sit around listening to this podcast.
I never,
No.
I've gotten to a
No.
point where I don't listen. To
I do
them.
not need to hear the sound of my own voice that much. So yeah, hard pass.
Poor Matilda has to listen to me talk
know.
all day and then get on the
And then get
computer and edit
home,
and
and there
listen
you
to me.
are. Yeah. Yeah.
What about they can't use public restrooms? They have to go home every time they have to go to the bathroom.
Oh, okay. I find this endearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like sounds like a little anxiety, a little pee shy. I don't think that ever hurt anybody. I think I could do that.
I get it. I find it cute too until
Yeah.
it's like you're actually having to deal with it.
True. Yeah, you're like traveling and you're miles away from the nearest private restroom.
That's tough.
Will they go in the woods? I think we need that. See, as a therapist, I just have more questions.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to make a decision based on this information.
Need more info.
Yeah, need more
Okay, that's
info.
fair. They don't believe in evolution.
They don't believe in evolution. That sounds like every person I grew up with.
Where'd you grow up?
Well, it was not so much where I grew up, but I grew up very evangelical.
Yeah.
I went to a college that barely taught evolution. So yeah, no, can't do, I mean, obviously.
You ghost, yeah. I grew up in
ghost.
Texas.
Okay.
So
you know, you know.
I very much,
Yes.
I feel the same way. All right. Thank you for playing.
Oh, you're so welcome. I want more, but maybe later, maybe after.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for this conversation. Thank you
Oh,
for
my
being here.
pleasure.
I'm sure that we're going to get a flood. This is going to help a lot of people.
I'll come back anytime.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you mind telling people where they can find you?
Yes. You can find me on Instagram at Queer Sex Therapy. If you're looking for a sex therapist, I've got a team of 30 of them at theexpansivegroup.com. And yeah, I'll see you there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank y'all for listening to today's episode. As always, help us spread the gay agenda by writing an Apple review, rating us on Spotify, and sharing it with everyone you've ever met. Made It Out is produced and edited by Matilda Jordan and worked on solely by lesbians.
We're going home now. We'll grab a slice of pizza, grab a taxi, babe.